Hey there, Banditos. Welcome to the latest episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah, and today I am personally super excited to welcome my old pal, my old supervisor for a time, Ben Abernathy, to the program. Ben has been all over the industry as an editor, started out as an assistant editor at Dark Horse Comics, then moved on to Marvel, which is where we met and worked together for, I don't know, roughly a year. Moved out to California to join Wildstorm, then got absorbed into DC, worked on DC Digital, worked on the CMX manga imprint, and then kind of took a left turn. Was a co-founder, in fact, of Madefire with Liam Sharp and others, which was kind of a motion comics, sort of bleeding edge technology kind of company. Very interesting. Ultimately did not make it, unfortunately. So Ben moved back to DC, became director of talent relations, then group editor, where he did a lot on the Batman books, including big introductions of talent like Chip Zdarsky and Jorge Jimenez. Then executive editor there, and now he's at Skybound, which is Robert Kirkman's company. He's doing the Energon universe. He's doing some creator-owned stuff. He's doing some horror anthologies. Did some editing on Battle Beast, and just having a great time bringing all these new properties into the world. So let's get to it. This is my friend, Ben Abernathy. Today, I am super excited to welcome my friend, my former boss, editor, Ben Abernathy.
Thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate it. I have long awaited my invitation to join you on this show, and I'm excited to talk some comics.
Well, I'm excited to have you. I've been begging you to be on forever, and now we have the opportunity to just jibber jabber all over the place. And we'll start with our first question, which you may or may not know. How did you first discover comic books?
How did I first discover comic books? I would probably have to say when I was, probably like 4 or 5 years old. I remember my older brother and my mom had dropped us off at my grandma's house if she was going to watch us while my mom ran errands and shopping or whatever. Now, it's probably like 1980, 1979, 1980, right around there. Not to date myself there. And I remember my grandma had a box of my uncle's comics from when he was like a kid. So these are comics from like, the 50s or something. And it was like some Uncle Scrooge comics and like Turok Dinosaur Hunter. And I remember like looking at these comics. They were fragile because again, they were old by that point, and just being kind of mesmerized by both of them because obviously Turok versus Uncle Scrooge, vastly different material. But it was just like so cool and fascinating to see more sophisticated visual storytelling that you might be getting in a board book, or you know what I mean, or like kind of like children's books of the era. So it was sort of mind blowing. I was like, what?
You'd
So
be
that was it.
amazed at how many folks bring up Uncle Scrooge and the sort of Duck comics as like their first introduction to comics. It's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was like Carl Barks. I think it was the Carl
Right.
Barks material at that point. It was phenomenal. I have all the hardcovers now, and it's definitely, I remember like now it's like, oh, I remember these. These are the ones my Uncle Denny had.
Now, did you look at these comics, and obviously you started getting more after you probably read these to like pieces. Um, did you figure out initially, or when did you figure out that like there are people behind these, people make these, this can be like a career, I may even want to work in this? Obviously you're a little kid when you first get the issues, but later on.
I think probably the first time I ever paid attention to who was making the comics was because, like, I didn't follow a traditional comic reader's path in a lot of ways. So my older brother took those same comics, that my uncle had, and then sort of gravitated immediately towards Marvel and DC books because, like, the newsstand was still prevalent at the time. There was a local comic shop in Bend, Oregon, where we grew up. But I kind of went an opposite direction in that from the library I got the first like technically graphic novels I guess I got were like the Tintin books by Hergé, and they had a bio in the back. So then you read about Hergé and I'm like, oh wow, this is like one guy did all this. Like that's sort of like mind blowing. And I'm not sure at that point in the early 80s, I don't think there were any American comics being collected in sort of any fashion. It was all periodical based. So it was like reading Red Rackham's Treasure from the Deschutes County Library that made me aware that, like, there are these, people that sort of sit behind, the desk and like work this stuff up. And then I became more aware of it reading my older brother's comics as he started buying heavily into Marvel and some DC and stuff. Because then you'd see, they had letter columns that, the editors, assistant editors would run, and you see all the credits to who everyone is. And you're like, who's Stan Lee? He's the narrator on that cartoon show I like with Spider-Man. So then it started, that awareness started to build from there. So.
Yeah. And how did you go from that awareness to, hey, like maybe I should do this for a career, or at least something coming out of, whether it was high school or college, like this is my a step or a direction to go in?
So this is probably the least sexy career path ever to like get into comics. So, fast forward to, or I guess rewind to the summer of 1996. I was like just wrapping up my junior year in college in Portland, Oregon. I was on track to get a history degree, and I didn't have any internships or anything lined up. Portland is not exactly the sexiest place for history internships. And by sheer chance, my friends and I at the time drove by Dark Horse Comics, which is in downtown Milwaukee, Oregon, which is a suburb of Portland. And I remember my brother was big. He loved Frank Miller, and he had read all like some of the early Sin City stuff and the Martha Washington stuff from Dark Horse. I remember I would read it, and we would both be like, "Where's Milwaukee? We're Milwaukee, Oregon. There's no Google Maps at the time, and we're like, where is that? We had no idea." So then, like, 1996, I come upon this like giant picture window that had an alien and a predator from the Fox franchises about to fight, and Dark Horse had the license at the time in the 90s or late 80s, I think, into the 90s, and really done well by them. So I called them up just randomly and was like, do you guys offer internships? Because wow, this would be pretty cool. Because on the one hand, being aware of writers and artists, I knew I had no talent on that front. I was like, there's these giant buildings in downtown Milwaukee, and they all say Dark Horse Comics. And like, gosh, look, there's clearly a lot of people that help like put all this stuff together. And long story short, I got an internship. They were like, we'll have to pay you. You'll be the editorial intern. Here's what your job will be. So those 4 months, sort of very eye-opening to the production and publishing side that, as a fan, I wasn't as aware of. And then when I graduated with my history degree, they hired me on as an assistant editor. And that was in January 1998. And I'm still here. And I've, obviously worked at different places. You and I met at Marvel, and I've worked at DC a couple times and in the digital space. So it's sort of on one hand, Mike, it's like a job I got out of college, and I'm still doing it. And then I blinked one day, and it became, geez, what am I, 27 years or something, that like career wise. And it's wild how time flies when you're having fun, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it may not be sexy, but it's an amazing story, at least for people who want to break into comics, that can just like notice a name and a visual on a building and call up and be like, hey, you got any internships, and how can we make things happen? So
yeah.
To each their own. So you were pretty quickly, I think, in that early period, you were at Dark Horse, then DC, then Marvel, probably in like successive years, right?
Correct. So it was like, what would I say, January of 98. I started at Dark Horse. And then I think July of 1999, I moved to New York City and got a job in the creative services department at DC, which after about 9 or 10 months, I was like, man, this is like not going to go anywhere as a career. And one of the managers in my group had worked with a guy named Bill Jemas. Yeah, I know you know that name. So does everyone else, I'm sure. But so Bill Jemas had just come into, the whatever he was. Was he president? I think he's president or publisher at, I don't remember his exact title,
No.
at Marvel. And while they were in the process of laying off most of the company, they were also bringing a lot of people in. So Ron Praz is his name. He put in a good word with Bill Jemas. And I ended up getting a job there again in creative services that then led into special projects, by the following year.
Yeah.
And then by 2002, I was back working for DC, but in their San Diego imprint, Wildstorm, which was they had bought from Jim Lee basically an Image in 1998. So I was an editor there. So yeah, in a quick few years, it was like Dark Horse, DC, Marvel, Wildstorm. It was like,
Right. Well, I mean, what was that like? I want to dig deeper, obviously, on your time at Marvel, which I'm sure was spectacular because,
it was
I was
amazing.
there.
You were there, yeah. Oh,
But
those
but
no
what was it
joke.
like just just sort of that quick succession? I mean, was it just sort of like a trial by fire, like you were getting exposed to all of these comic companies in such a short period of time?
Yeah, it was interesting too because I went from assistant editor to creative services coordinator, and then ultimately a job that morphed into special projects. And it was interesting because a year and a half plus the 4 months internship and editorial, I've got a pretty good hand, I think, on like the skill set of an assistant editor. And then the creative services stuff at DC, it was sort of a department they were like rebuilding at the time because part of my job was this is my Wildstorm connection is as I had mentioned, Wildstorm was purchased in 98 or the end of 98, I believe. And so by 1999, they were like, we need somebody on staff in New York to actually traffic all of the materials that the Wildstorm editors and marketing people were sending in because it was just sort of like, all over the place. So that was partly what my job was. But then it was also like box comps to send for archives or like grunt work or, you know what I mean? And so like I pretty quickly saw there was not much future on that front. And one of the things too, and I'm sure you've witnessed this too, Mike, at your time at Marvel, early on at DC, you start to realize there's so many people that are just their entire career was spent there, and this is all they ever wanted to do was like all I ever wanted to do was work at DC Comics. And so it was also very clear that any upward mobility was going to take years. And I didn't have the patience for that at that time. And when I left, Paul Levitz actually pulled me aside because they knew I was going to Marvel. And he was like, well, I'm not going to do a Paul Levitz impression here, but he was like, um, go
Better not.
learn everything you can from Marvel. And then, we'll hire you back, with all those secrets or whatever, which actually ended up happening, obviously. But
Yeah.
and then the Marvel was very much like the Wild West, as I'm sure you remember. It was like gunslinging. I started doing creative services work in one department that was sort of like they didn't know what they were doing. The guy that I reported to was a complete burnout and just didn't care. And there were a lot of layoffs in that time and a lot of upheaval because like I was hired by Bob Harris, who then I think about a month later he was ousted and Joe Quesada came in as editor in chief. And there was a point when special projects where you and I are working on like Marvel magazines, we're doing reprints, we're working on video game stuff. It was like it was wild just how much we were doing and the output in that era. And it was a lot of fun. But I think probably with a lot of people after 9/11, I started thinking like, being a West Coast kid, I was like, Marvel was kind of going through upheavals again, and I felt like it was probably time to pack up and head back west. Which I ended up doing and doing some freelance stuff for Marvel and during that period, and then ended up transferring, like moving back over to DC down in San Diego. But it was a fascinating time. I look back at that Marvel era. At the time, obviously, it was very stressful. It's probably when my hair really started to turn white. You can't see it,
And
you
mine my
know.
way.
Right, exactly. But we, obviously made bonds, connections for life. But like we worked on some really, you know, it's probably like any business, right? But in a business like publishing or entertainment, things happen so fast, and sometimes you don't take a moment to really think about what we accomplished. And I found a box recently. You can see all these boxes in here of the Ultimate Marvel magazines that we did, and the Marvel
Yep.
Knights magazines and stuff. And I'm like, these were so ahead of their time. Like, you know what I mean? And we did great stuff. Like for the value for 3 issues for like $3.99 or whatever it was, oversized
Yeah.
glossy paper. I was like, there was some really cool stuff. And at the time, it was more like, oh God, we got to get another one to print. Where's that Randy Macho Man Savage interview? Like stuff like that. But like we
Yeah.
did some really cool stuff, and sort of time just sort of like flew by. And but yeah, like I said, I guess it's good to take a beat and just remember, like, man, we did all of that. All those
Yeah.
reprints, all those collected editions, that was us. Like everything you see now, we started a department that was doing like 8 books a year. I think we did 40 in our first year or something.
Yeah.
And it's just like, you know,
That's exactly what I was going to bring up is that you we may undersell it, but what you did and the folks in the team did was really restart or kind of start because that was really when trade paperbacks were taking off.
Right.
You know, I mean, there were collected editions before that, there were graphic novels, but not in the way that there were starting in that period of time. And so it was just like putting that factory together.
Yeah. You,
And
you're right, because
it's just a big,
at
big
that
lift.
yeah, exactly. I didn't mean to cut you off, Mike. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
But I was just gonna say I was excited. I'm like, you know what? And thinking about that too, it's like DC had an entire departments that both editorial design, production for their collected edition programs, where then, Marvel would be like, oh, it's time to do an Elektra Assassin trade. And then that'd be the one book that one person would, work on or do. One of the stunning things, and I'm sure you remember this too, like doing collected editions, is like so DC was all digital for the most part at this point in 2000, 2001. Marvel it was all film. Like
I know.
my first book was Earth X, and that book had just come out, and then they send me literally 200 pounds of film, and you had to assemble. Remember this, right? Find the CMYK. You had to find 4 pieces of every single page, label it, and then refile it, and then that would go to the printer, and that's what they would use. Where my friends at DC would be like, "Oh my God, you guys are using film? What's going on there?" And I was like, "I don't know."
I mean, I remember, and I brought this up as we were, chatting beforehand, that you had to make like a major trip to I guess, the
Yuma.
warehouse in Yuma, Arizona, where all this film was, to figure out what was there, how to organize it, how to get it back in order to be, because I think a lot of it it was black and white and needed to be recolored, or if it was colored, it needed to be decolored and then recolored.
Yep, all of
I
the
just
above.
remember that being like such a huge burden to get these things out.
It was horrifying too, Mike, because I don't know if you remember seeing the photos, but Ike Perlmutter, our old boss. I remember riding with him in his limo over to that warehouse that they had in Midtown, where they originally housed all the film. But when
Okay. Yeah.
they emptied out that warehouse to go to Yuma, Arizona, they just hired some rando guys, and all they did was literally throw all these boxes into this like trailer, like these giant semi trailers. And we had photos of like stuff busted open. They destroyed a lot of film in their carelessness. Things got lost. It's sort of horrifying to think about like how much legacy might have been lost in that move. And the whole reason, do you remember even the reason why they moved it to Yuma, Arizona?
I can only imagine, because it was cheaper.
Well, yes, but they had a huge warehouse there it was for their like kite and model rocket factory for Toy
Okay,
Biz.
this is coming back.
And it's stunning. I'm sure everyone listening is be stunned to know that the bottom apparently had fallen out on the kite market in America in like the late 90s. So it was largely empty. There was like Denmark and China, I think, were the only places that they were shipping heavy kites to. So they had so much empty space, and they were like, well, it's dry there. So isn't that better for books and
Right.
stuff? And so, yeah, I went out, Dan Carr, who was the head of production at the time, and I flew out there and spent, I don't know, 3 or 4 days sort of helping them organize stuff. And then after I left staff, I went and spent another week there because they were basically, Gemis was like, we need like 10 months worth of collected editions pulled, and we don't know what to do. One of the tricks, maybe you recall this, or maybe you've blacked it out of your mind, was like they'd lost film for key issues. So you always had to remember like the reprints, like whatever it was, Marvel Team Up or whatever the issues stuff had like been reprinted. And so basically I was on a scavenger hunt there to find all this film for like a publishing slate for, I don't know, it was like 6 to 8 months. And that's where I found all that original artwork. It was wild. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so then Wildstorm, right? I mean, not directly right after your Yuma trip, but soon after, like you said, after September 11th, and everyone, I think, sort of, looking inward and figuring out what they really want to do, where they want to be. You said like West Coast, let's go. How did that
Yeah.
all come about?
Yeah. Being from Oregon, I miss my family. I did 2.5 years in New York. And it's growing up on a farm in Central Oregon to then live in New York for a couple of years. I don't think I was like, really, I think 2.5 years was my limit. Let's put it that way. I wanted sort of a change of pace. Like, Marvel was sort of like we rolled with the punches and like, kind of managed so much at that time. But also it was just like exhausting as well. And, we had constant sort of pivots and stuff. And um, it just felt like a time to like head home and, like you said, sort of like see what opportunities were there. In the back of my mind, honestly, Mike, I'd always thought like I loved working at Dark Horse. When I was an assistant editor, it was like my favorite job of all time. I'd always had in the back of my head that I would end up back there someday. And so I was in talks with Mike Richardson and stuff when I moved back about, potential opportunities, but that got sidelined due to some financial problems. They had a distributor that went out of business or went bankrupt and they froze a bunch of their money, so they couldn't like hire anybody. So, and then, Scott Dumir and John Nee got in touch with like, hey, you want to be an editor at Wildstorm? And I was like, yeah, let's go. They were like, you got to be here in like 3 weeks. And I was like, oh my gosh. So I had to break my lease and move down there, but it was awesome. And Watson was a lot of fun.
So at Wildstorm, you were actually in editorial proper, which was kind of a change from your previous positions where you were mostly in creative services, collected editions, things like that. Did you feel ready? Was there any kind of reticence? Like, am I ready to do kind of the big game? So as it were?
Right. Definitely. Because you're right. For the like 2.5 years up to that point, I'd largely been out of editorial. Because I mean, collected editions, the magazines we worked on, they're all editorial to varying degrees. But original material and content, is its own sort of beast. And I mean, I'll be honest, and this is probably the vast majority of people in comic books would answer this, but like I suffer from like, fraud syndrome, like imposter syndrome. So it was daunting because, there's that constant feeling and like, oh, I'm not good enough, or, maybe I'm not smart enough, or like everyone's better at this than I am, all that kind of stuff. And, that has been sort of a specter my entire life, but it also pushes me to work harder. I'm always like, well, if I'm not the best editor or the smartest guy, I can outwork people. And, I put a lot of work and a lot of effort in, into the editorial process, both in like, the ideation and the building of the teams and the sort of like overall execution, from end to end. And, the opportunity to Wildstorm was great because, I'd been a fan. I started the point where I started buying comic books sort of marginally was the Image era. I like, loved Jim Lee on X-Men and, McFarlane on Spider-Man and stuff. So I had bought a bunch of the Wildstorm stuff. I was that guy that bought 25 issues of Stormwatch. Probably the only guy. But so there's
I have
like a
quite a
great
few.
opportunity. I knew the universe, you know what I mean? I loved
Yeah.
Wildcats and but I also liked, it was a great time at Wildstorm because the ABC line with Alan Moore was just starting to get up and running. They were doing originals, the Cliffhanger line and Homage were like hugely successful. And then they had like killer license stuff like Thundercats and stuff in the works. So one of the things that I took away from my time at Dark Horse, because at one point at Dark Horse, I was the assistant editor of the entire editorial group. I was the only assistant editor on the payroll. So I have always liked variety. So I love the variety of working on third-party license stuff, on, you know, internal like superhero stuff or created stuff or original stuff with creators and or even reprint stuff like working on manga or reprinting other stuff, which is we did a lot of that at Wildstorm as well. So I really just like I love the variety and just worked hard and was given a lot of great opportunities with some great creators. And it was a lot of fun. And plus, our offices were 2 blocks off the beach in La Jolla, California. It was insane. It was insane.
I remember that. I remember talking to you during that time, and yeah, it's a lot of sort of you guys obviously were working hard and put out a lot of great stuff, but there was I could sense some like beach bum culture and be like let's just go get a drink at the beach after a
Yeah.
hard day at the office.
Like there was a colorist on staff that he would go like swim in the Pacific Ocean, come back all wet, and go back to coloring like Mad Magazine or whatever. It was
Right.
wild. I was like, that guy, he's figured
He's
life out.
living he's living life.
He knows what's
He's doing
up.
something right. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
So by this point, you had been, even if they were short stints, at Dark Horse, DC, Marvel. How did Wildstorm compare to those experiences in terms of culture, in terms of the work you're doing? You're obviously doing like some, probably more interesting and varied work than you had been before. But what was Wildstorm like compared to your experiences in those other more major offices, I guess?
I would say, for like to a large degree, compared to say Marvel, it was stable. Because Dark Horse and DC were really stable. Marvel was very sort of, unstable at a lot of different points. So the stability and leadership was like really solid at Wildstorm. And then the opportunities and the trust. Because when I started, it was my Scott Doonbeer was the group editor, it was myself. It was, I think Jeff Marriott was the senior editor, but Jeff Marriott ended up leaving within a couple of months of me starting. Um, so like we had a small staff with a lot going on, but it was like we had a great support staff too, which something which we didn't really have totally necessarily at Marvel. And at DC, like, so low on the totem pole, I guess I was the support staff, but we had, designers and pre-press and, it was also like, you know, all the Wildstorm artists still came in and would draw like all day. Like Lieber Mayho, Carlos Deanda, Jim Lee was gone for my first year, but then he started coming into the office all the time too. So Wildstorm was fascinating in that probably even though it was an imprint of DC, I think it was probably the only fully functional, end-to-end comic book publisher at that point. Because we also had a Wildstorm Effects, like an award-winning coloring department. Like it was, you know, it was a mini publisher in and all of itself. Unfortunately we didn't have any like the marketing staff, the redundancies got, when they purchased Wildstorm, they laid off the licensing and marketing people. And they all went and started IDW. Not kidding. That is literally the truth. But the stability and just like having, and it felt, and maybe it's like you said, that California like beach vibes or whatever, but like everyone just like worked together. You know what I mean? And it was very casual and like friendly. Like after hours, they had linked computers and people would play like Ghost Recon and stuff and, hang out with, get drinks after work and stuff. It was just a very cool like vibe. I don't want to say it was like a family or anything along those lines because I wouldn't classify it as that, but a lot of camaraderie, you know what I mean? And like sort of common purpose. And um, although as a newer guy, I got sick of hearing like, in the good old days, when we, you know,
Yeah.
Battle Chasers #1 sold 1 million copies or whatever. And you're like, oh yeah,
Right,
yeah.
right, right.
Cool, 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 cool. I mean, those stories are great, but yeah. So, it was a great time. And I was ended
Was
up that it was like 10 years. I was there for 10 years. So that was my nomad comic career had finally found, that home because it was 8 years basically of Wildstorm, and then Wildstorm was shuttered, and Wildstorm evolved into the DC Digital Group, which then we were handling all the digital first content, all the Amazon or Comixology stuff at the time, all the licensed stuff. So it was quite an interesting time because we also like in that time. So Wildstorm was like we had the Wildstorm Universe stuff, we had all the creator owned stuff, but we also launched a manga imprint. A lot of people
right.
forget DC had a manga imprint called CMX. We handled like, oh God, it was a deal with like, was it Rebellion or 2000 AD? So we were helping handle like all these reprints of like all these French and English books and like I think Judge Dredd and stuff. Um, we did like a lot of licensed content too. So, we did a lot of video game content. I'll tell you, after the success of the Uncharted movie and the coming Modern Warfare movie and stuff too. Like there's all this content based on the comic, not based on our comics, but we were working on comics way ahead of like any sort of major media exposure for a lot of these things. I actually have a stack of like Gears of War comics. I was like digging these out recently. So I was like this I think was like had the highest print run in like 2006 or something for DC. Like so it was a great time. And I again, like I
Was
said, I love the variety of like working on all this content.
Yeah, I was gonna say, well, a number of things I was gonna say. Well, first of all, who was the artist on the Gears of War? Because I remember talking to someone about
Liam
that.
McCormick Sharp.
Yep. Yep. I remember talking to him about that. Yeah.
It was fun stuff.
And that being sort of like a crazy, like, I mean, who's to know how well it was going to do and sell. But yeah, going back to sort of the variety, I mean, was it challenging to work on so many different formats at the same time? You had licensed comics, you had manga, you had foreign reprints. I mean, that's all kind of very different, like,
Yes.
muscles and skills to use.
Yes. Yes. And there's even more that I didn't even touch upon. But yes, no, there was a lot. And I'll be honest with you, like I'd mentioned, it's just like, I put the work in. I think probably most people who've worked with me would that would be like if they had to describe Ben, he was like hardworking. And so I always had a lot going on. And I was also the guy that was just like, let's go, like team, psht, you know. So there was a point where I was editing all the CMX, all the manga content on top of like most of the Wildstorm materials. And there was that point, I'm not gonna lie, where I was like, I would get up at like 5 in the morning from home and I'd review like manga books and put notes because they get printouts and like red pen it. But then I'd go to the office and I'd be reading like a Wildcats issue and I would read it backwards because like I'd read it like Japanese from or right to left, and then I'd be like, oh my God, this book doesn't make any sense. What have I done? And then like, oh, and it's like slap slap. Okay, right, that's right. Now it's left
Reorient.
to right. Yes, it's a U.S. comic, and so there were those points where you kind of lose yourself and like, what am I working on now? Because it's just like just rolling. Because like you know, there's deadlines every week, like nonstop, 52 weeks a year, in publishing. And when you have a heavy workload, which I tend to carry, it's just like it never ends. Um, Never ends, Mike. No, I'm
Yeah.
just kidding. But
Which is good because that keeps your keeps your career going, right?
my
Uh,
wife's very happy.
right,
Yes. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. I'm sure family and you're very happy, and I mean you're doing something you love. So
Yeah.
even if it is a lot of it, ultimately you're where you want to be, hopefully.
Yeah.
Um, so as you said, you sort of segued already, is that you went into as DC took over Wildstorm, I guess.
Yep.
Is that when now did you take on DC Digital as another piece of what you were doing, or was it a kind of a hard transition away from what you were doing for Wildstorm into this new group?
We so under like Hank Canals, who was the general vice president, general manager of Wildstorm, like a lot of this content was sent our way because like again, we had the resources to get content done, and we had people like Hank or myself that could like adapt and deliver it. And so the digital stuff started to kind of creep in. I don't remember, 2008, 2009, around then, because like different like platforms were starting to experiment with comics like on their platforms. So, Comixology obviously was one of the early ones. We were working with PlayStation because we had a deal with like Sony Online, like there was a
Mhm.
DC game, but we are also doing a bunch of the comic books based on Sony content. And so I don't know if anyone even remembers this, but the PlayStation Portable, the PSP, had a comic. You could read comic books on it. And so we would adapt our books so that you could read them on the PSP. And shockingly, it never really took off. Um, because like people are like, I don't want to read comic books on my PlayStation Portable. I want to like play video games. But we were starting to do, in like custom comics that were like digital or components. And so we were basically sort of on the tip of the spear on that for DC. And so then it kind of increased as, Wildstorm, we were going through as Paul Levitz was sort of phasing out, and we were, Jim Lee and Dan DiDio came on board as publishers. The decision was to like basically invest, shutter Wildstorm and focus that, editorial group and production group and stuff on digital. So then we were very early adopters for, digital first content, which our editorial group handled. We were still doing a lot of the licensed stuff. But then like again, like custom projects, motion comics, like all that kind of stuff, we were pretty, heavily involved with. And so I don't remember if it was like 2010 or 2011 when they I think it was 2010 maybe when they officially closed Wildstorm. And then I was promoted to group editor for DC Digital. So then we moved up in 2011 is when DC staked their claim in Burbank and started to move offices out. So the New York offices wouldn't move till like 4 or 5 years later, but Wildstorm, we moved up that summer. And so then I spent a year in Burbank dealing with Comixology stuff because at this point, all the editors, we could all like author a guided view in Comixology. Shout out John Roberts, who we used to work with
Yep.
at Marvel. Um, and then Amazon was doing their own digital stuff. Like we were QCing, QAing, whatever you want to call it, all of the digital stuff on every platform. It was like, it was an immense amount of work on top of everything else we were doing. And I was burned out by then. And one of the clients that we were talking to, which was co-founded by Liam McCormick Sharp, was called Madefire. and they were based out of San Francisco, or the Bay Area rather, East Bay. They were in Berkeley, and they had been talking to me for a year or two up leading up to that point, to where then they hired me in 2012, in like September, I think, as their editor-in-chief, their first editor-in-chief, to go make motion books and sort of like, you know, explore the frontier of digital comics as to what was to come, which then, you know, started another sort of shorter stint, I guess, in my career, which was, you know, fascinating times. The wild west of digital comics in the early, you know, in 2012, 2013 was an interesting time.
Yeah, I mean, you were sort of at the leading edge, as it were, although, you know, the edge, I guess, quickly moved to different places. But let's
Yeah,
stay on
yeah, yeah,
stay on it for just a second. You have I mean, you really do have a huge career and a lot of places to go. But so hopefully I can get through everything, and I
yeah.
definitely want to talk about Skybound. But anyway, Madefire. Can you tell those who don't quite understand or know what motion comics were
Yep.
and what the goal of Madefire was for comics in general, and how to like move them into a different, I guess, format or space.
Yeah. So, you know, Eugene Walden, Ben Wolstenholme, and Liam Sharp had come together. They were the three founders of Madefire, and they saw an opportunity in the digital space to like basically create an augmented reading experience. Not like AR or anything that like Marvel and DC had been experimenting with at that point, where you like download something on, you know, your phone or whatever, and you can look at it, but like an actual like sort of a curated reading experience with adding in some music and some limited motion to then, then with, you know, the basic sort of like, you know, I don't want to call it pan and scan, but like, you know, um, app viewer to then, you know, create content that was a reading experience, but also more immersive.
Hmm.
Because, you know, right around this time, I think, gosh, I don't know the dates. We'll have to check this one out. It was 2010. It was like when the tablets first started to appear. Because in a lot of
Right,
ways,
like iPad and stuff.
yeah, Madefire had a close relationship with Apple at the time. And so as the iPad was starting to become the definitive you know, device, and smartphones were starting to get bigger and the screens, more elaborate, they saw an opportunity to create content that was sort of next level, that was, you know, for phones in particular, for instance, this would be a better reading experience than, say, you know, Comixology or whatever equivalents there were at that time. And so it was, you know, initially only for iOS. You know, a lot of investment went into finding great creators and like great ideas and genres, and but the backbone of it all was they had a tool that Eugene had developed, that you could build your own motion books. You could like take your own created art, you know, music library, and the goal on that front was also to then, you know, we later partnered with DeviantArt to try to get creators. We wanted people to create their own motion books and use our storefront to then, you know, monetize and, you know, release their content and stuff. And it was like a very elaborate, you know, sort of vision and plan. And, you know, it was, for a couple of years, it was great. Um, and like very, you know, cutting edge technology and stuff. But then, as you sort of foreshadowed, with Comixology being sold to Amazon, and it started to shake up the entire landscape of digital comics. And while we're proud of what we did, you know, we had some great, you know, relationships with DC and Marvel, like all the like publishers, all the standard big publishers in comics. They didn't land, or didn't, you know, monetize, I guess, in the hope that that Madefire, or our investors, were really looking for. And, you know, I left in 2015, in February 2015, and Madefire was around for years after that. They were developing content, I think, for the Oculus Rift, like, you know, VR headsets and stuff. Hope that's not top secret. I don't think it is. But you know, trying to like continue to be ahead of that curve. And, you know, I got out at that point partly because like having had a baby on startup insurance, and then another baby on the way, like very practical life had come in, and where it's like, oh man, startup insurance is for healthy young men, not people with
Right,
families. So
right,
then
right.
it also, so at this point it coincided, all of DC was all starting to move out. They had made their plans in New York. They were shuttering those offices, and they were relocating everyone out. So there were a lot of jobs available. So that was the point. Like I applied for the director of talent relations at DC, and then I ended up getting that position and then moved back to Burbank. So I went back to DC for a third time.
Right. And things, eventually kind of blew up for you. But I have one more question just because I'm
Yeah,
curious what your thought would be on this, and that is sort of this motion comics format, and being sort of a halfway point maybe between traditional comics reading and I guess maybe animation, like full animation.
hmm
And and this is getting sort of into more of the theory of comics, but I wonder if how this strikes you that there are advantages to the traditional comics reading, right? So that because the reader has a role to play in sort of filling in the action and emotion in between the panels, right?
right,
And whereas animation is really you're more of a passive sort of
right,
observer of whatever the story is going on. That trying to find that halfway point is difficult because you're trying to split the baby almost,
right,
of two
right.
very different ways of consuming
Yep.
storytelling.
Yeah, and I would be so bold or arrogant to say we split that baby in half. No, I'm just kidding. But no, I'm very proud of, what we were doing with the motion books because I do think it actually sort of like, walked that razor's edge between the two really well. Because I mean, you didn't have to have the music or anything, and the motion was very limited, and it was, chosen. It was not we were not trying to create animation. We were not, and it didn't look like we were trying to create animation because we
Yeah,
were, we built motion books based on DC, like traditional DC comics as well as like Valiant and stuff, and Hellboy in Hell was a great example that we did, and so it was very limited and tastefully done. I have some thoughts as to partly why I think, that Madefire didn't land quite like I thought it would. Partly, I'll just go ahead and say it, is one of the things that appealed to me is my daughter at the time. She was 4, I think. And so, as she's sort of developing mind and like, kind of like hunger for entertainment, she really enjoyed the motion books because the music and it was engaging in a way that she found just to be fun, you know what I mean? And her own sort of experience. The problem with Madefire is that there was no content for children. Like not until like basically I had started there. A lot of the material that Liam and Ben had sort of brought in were a lot of like creators that Liam had worked with at 2000 AD, or sort of like great established creators like Dave Gibbons or, Bill
yeah,
Sienkiewicz. And like all the content tended to be mature. I remember being
right.
at New York Comic Con in 2012 and people would bring their kids over and they're like, what do you have for kids? And we're like, nothing. I sadly, you know what I mean? And like, so
Yeah,
one of the things that I really pushed for and like the content that was like all ages was stuff because again, I had my kid and I couldn't show her any of this stuff or some limited because it's all like gunfights or it's like, dramatic stuff. And,
yeah.
and I do feel that like, maybe if we'd had some like younger skewing stuff as, a new generation is starting to experience and read and, et cetera on tablets, I think maybe that would have made a difference. I have no idea, but having had that like just people disappointment, they could their kids they were like, oh my God, look at that. There's an iPad right there. I want to look. Wait, what can I read? And we're like, probably nothing.
Right,
You know what I
right.
mean? And like you can't really
Yeah.
experience it, and the parents be like, oh, that sucks, and then they would like leave and stuff. And I, again, like I think that the all ages stuff that we started to get on there probably was a little late by that point. Um, but you live and you learn. So
I mean, it's a really interesting point because even as I look around with my own daughter and just kind of, anecdotally, I feel like the age group that uses iPads most often are kids and tweens and maybe teens. I don't know, maybe it's passé by the time the teenagers are all on phones. But
100%.
but that's a great point. Like, finding the audience that is where they're at, which is, these kids and doing
Right.
storytelling in that way for
Yep.
that group is hey, you're on to something. Maybe a few years late.
Dang it. Yeah.
But
Yeah, yeah. And it was a competitive market, and things
sure.
along those
Yeah.
lines too. So I mean, I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah.
But it led to a great opportunity at DC. Because then I was
Absolutely.
back out of editorial and I was director of talent
Right.
relations. So
Yeah,
then
tell me about that. Because it was not, like you said, not editorial. It's kind of a new position. What I don't know if it was a
I
new
have,
position at DC, but like it was a new position to you. What was and is talent relations, and what did you do?
what's interesting is that DC, I think, was to this day, because they still have a talent relations and they had a version of talent relations before I had started. But as they were moving out, and DC was sort of evolving, I guess, they kind of wanted like a different person in this role because traditionally it had been more of an editorial. I mean, there's still editorial services and stuff, but it tended to be more just like, I don't know, like exclusive creator driven, contracts, things along those lines, more administrative, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think the vision that they wanted the director of talent relations to be was, someone that had, well, a background in editorial, which obviously I did. So like the goal would be to help manage and like troubleshoot problems with all the exclusive talent, but also keep an eye out for new talent and be able to articulate and talk to editorial in ways um, to help foster you know relationships with new talent. I'd be like, what Marvel creators should I go after? And I'll start bugging them, things along those lines. We worked with a lot of, there was a lot of administrative stuff as well, dealing with like onboarding new creators and um, you know, setting people up on direct deposit or like all this kind of like probably more boring stuff. Comps, we handled the comp lists for all the publishing and art returns and stuff. But then like the goal, because Hank Canals, who was the head of this group, who was my old boss at Wildstorm, he also, I think, wanted someone in me in particular in this position because there was an opportunity, probably seeing the coming waves of variant covers and like other sort of opportunities to have someone who could help sort of manage things, the creatively manage those things, in a trustworthy and like, sharp eye manner, which like I provided. And so, by 2016, I think it was, I was involved as we were talking, before, we hopped on the air here, but like I was part of the retailer variant cover program and the overall variant program for Rebirth, which was DC's big initiative. I think it was 2016. I'll have to go back and look. But so that was the point when DC brought on variant covers for everything, like a standard, B cover. This is before it became like 10 covers per comic or whatever it is
Right.
now, this new Batman comic that's got 1,000 covers. But during Rebirth, it was like, okay, so Mike Farah, the editor, you handle the A cover, Ben will handle your B cover, and then I will get, the artists and, we'll go. So, I was assigned like 6 comics to start. It was like, John Constantine Hellblazer, Red Hood, I don't remember what the Batgirl and the Birds of Prey. And so then it was exciting because again, I kept in touch with artists. People knew me and trusted me. And like from the time I've been in editorial and again, being able to, interact well with editorial and the other groups, knowing how the sausage is made, it was actually ended up being a very sort of, I think beneficial, position to have me in and, working on all these covers. It was like a lot of fun, the retailer covers, and that ended up leading to like reigniting my passion for comic books, to which then led to dun dun dun. You can't read it, I don't know. I pitched this project called Deceased at DC because
Oh, I've heard of it.
yeah, maybe you have. It was one of those things where then it's just like, again, like I said, I'm a busybody, I guess, where I'm always like, I need to do two people's jobs, in the span of like 1 12-hour day. Because, 10, 12 hours are my average workday. So, I saw an opportunity. DC was starting once again imprints, right? So they were looking at doing Black Label, that was under development, middle grade books, for running young readers, both middle grade and the young adult. And I was in this meeting randomly where Dan DiDio was like, all this stuff's late and we need ideas and like, come on, guys. And all of editorial was just like this. And they're like, because it's like they were doing double ships. They'd been doing double ships and I think everyone was burned out. I'm in the
Yeah.
back. I'm like, you know what? I got this idea. And look, that's a whole nother episode we talk about how Deceased came about. But so ended up, working on this book. My side hustle while I was still doing all this director of talent relations stuff, because we'd handle summits and travel and like all this kind of fun stuff, conventions. green rooms. I guess I got tracked and sidetracked into the creative side because there was a lot of different stuff that we did in talent relations. But then, like, I started editing comics again, and Deceased ended up being one like the biggest book of 2019, I think. And so then, that kind of reminded, I guess, the higher ups that like, hey, Ben used to be a group editor, didn't he? That guy knows what he's talking about. So then by shoot, October 2019, Dan DiDio took me out to lunch and was just basically like, here's what's going to happen. I need you to be a group editor. And he basically was like, you can choose. Do you want to be the Gotham group editor or do you want to be the Justice League group editor? But I want you to be the Gotham group editor. And I was like, I guess I'll be the Gotham group editor. And so, boom, I went from director of talent relations to then back into editorial and like the most high profile, like high pressure editorial group in all of comics, which was the Bat family, like overseeing the Bat family and taking over, the reins of, the post Tom King, Batman run, which, you know, like if I'm just rambling, feel free to jump in
No,
or
no.
like
I well,
stop me. Yeah,
I don't like to interrupt, but it's I mean, I'm sure it didn't seem like that at the time, but it does seem like sort of one seamless kind of from here from A to B to C. But becoming group editor of the Bat books, or I guess so it was considered the Gotham
Gotham. Yeah, it was
books,
the
yeah,
Gotham
because it was
editorial group.
more than just Batman, I guess. Um, so, but your talent relations experience, I think, played probably a heavy role in those books because you ended up bringing on folks like, and I hope I don't butcher the names, James Tynion, is it, or
Yeah.
Tinian?
Well,
The fourth.
James had already been hired, actually.
Oh,
James was
okay.
already on board. I mean, but I talked to James a bunch. Like we dealt with, helped him book travel for shows. I'd seen him at
Right,
conventions.
right.
So the talent
Yeah.
relations side's totally played in. I knew everybody. I knew all the players. They knew who I was. Tom King had made a comment. Was like, "Weren't you the guy serving me a turkey sandwich like a month ago at New York Comic Con? And now you're the head Batman guy." Like what? Which is true. I was like, "Yeah, that was me. That was me there."
Man, you contain multitudes.
Exactly. So,
Turkey sandwiches editing.
but what really came into play, Mike, too, was that like having done the variant covers, gotten back into the rhythm of talking to a lot of different creators. So, one of the Guillaume March, who is a phenomenal artist, and he had been doing variant covers for me on Red Hood, among other things. So I had a good working relationship with him. I knew his schedule. He was the first like Batman artist I hired when I came on board because like he had drawn, Talon, he'd drawn Batman issues and stuff before so he worked with James. So like, but I was like, I know the perfect guy for this because he'd been doing all this work for me on the variant cover side was talent relations, and Guillaume came on board, and he was the first one of many Batman artists I hired because when I took over it was Batman 86. It was still double shipping for all of 2020. That was awesome. You go like I started, no joke, in October, and the first two issues came out in January, and it was like you got to go. So I came in. James had written one script. Tony Daniel was the ongoing artist. He ended up quitting before he finished issue one, before he finished 86. So then I came in and was like, had to get just like all these scripts done, had to find a platoon of artists and like, probably, it's a blurry time. It's a lot of late nights and a lot of work, but we hit the ground running, and James was just an amazing, creator to work with. This was, the book he'd been building to because he'd been doing 2 or 3 years, I think, in Rebirth on Detective Comics, and he'd worked with Scott Snyder, who's like his mentor on a lot of, New 52 Batman related stuff. So he was ready. He was like, had this Batman story to tell, and Jorge Jimenez is probably the most significant hire that I had made because he had come on and he drew, I think, 89 and then came on for the Joker War arc because it was constantly juggling. Doing two
Right.
issues a month, it was just like boom, 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 boom. And so, we were just burning rubber. And that also like ran headlong into in 2020. Everyone had a rough 2020, but it was like, not only with the pandemic, we had like seismic changes corporately because we wondered, what we later learned, we laid off like 20 some percent of our company that year. And that what we learned, it was AT&T was pivoting towards a merger, a spinoff merger with Discovery. And so while like again, it was like the Wild West and people like, of all the awfulness and stress and, anxiety, that came in death that came with the pandemic, people were buying a lot of comic books too. There was a resurgence in I think tangible, like, valuables in the sense of like our variant covers were selling and, there's a huge explosion of original art and collectibles and stuff. And the books were selling really well. And it was, you know, it was sort of a wild time. And then trying to like keep our editorial groups together again as they're laying everybody off. We had two significant layoffs that saw different, Dan DiDio was a pre-layoff. He left the company in February. Then we had, sort of like people running it that summer that then they got laid off in like August. And then we had a new general manager at the start of September. And that guy got laid off like a little over a year later, fired. I remember it was just like, it was such a wild time of upheaval and creativity and just like perseverance for a lot of hardworking creators and hardworking like staff. And, um, I'm very proud of that time because again, like the adversity and we kept all the books on time and I think delivered some great content. Got a bunch more deceased in there, even though I was editing Batman. I was like, we got to do more deceased, and it was a wild time, tiring. You know,
I can imagine. I can
yeah.
imagine. Before we get to, your current gig at Skybound,
Mhm.
I'd like to ask a few more sort of general questions about kind of your editorial style. One is obviously you have this background with talent relations, and probably feeds into this, but how do you know who to bring on, especially when it comes to kind of more emerging talent rather than those that are kind of established, which, you can probably identify who would be good that everybody knows about. But when it's
Yeah.
someone that you're taking a chance on to be like, oh, this is going to be now a regular Batman artist, they haven't done anything of this level before. Like, what makes you confident that that's the person?
Well, I like to say that like I found the needles in the haystacks as they were, with DC in particular on a book, say like Batman or Harley Quinn or Red Hood, the various stuff I was working on. The process typically for newer talent, especially, particularly artists and stuff, would be, we had talent development programs, we had like anthologies and short stories. So even though they might have done a lot of indie work or image books or boom books and stuff too, there would be often like a process to kind of get them in to like basically see what they can do under our deadlines, you know what I mean, and like how they are like in a working relationship and kind of work their way up to sort of toward a monthly series or sort of or a big opportunity in that sense. And I don't know. Like in some ways, you've been around comic books long enough. I bet you have this talent as well. Like a lot of people say, you can see samples, you can look at someone's art, and depending on what your like where your style interests are. Like I have my own sort of specific interests or tastes, and everyone has their own specific tastes. But I'd like to think you can kind of tell, like if someone's ready to turn that corner, or if they are, do they just need the encouragement, to sort of like move forward? Because in some cases this is a business and there's always the like comics will break your heart kid or horror stories of just like struggle and death and things along those lines. And for me is one of the like my core tenets editorially. Sorry, this is sort of a segue, is like empathy. The creative teams I work with are like we're locked arm in arm, we're in this together. They're not disposable pieces to a machine that just churns out Batman comics or you know you know forgotten when the door closes or things along those lines. And it's I think the best content was created when we're all on the same page and they're supported. One of the things I would always try to do editorially, and this is where something like Deceased came about, was like kind of I create this sort of like bubble where we can just create and like do something cool and not worry about whatever stresses schedules or budgets or things along those lines. And so support the creators and empower them to sort of bring their A game to what we're doing and hopefully inspire them too. And I think coming out of talent relations and the career that I'd had up to that point, I had a lot of trust and creators believed me at my word. And I'd like to think that for the most part, everything was like, for good or bad. Sometimes books, some of the best books I've ever worked on never found an audience. So sometimes it's like, man, I was really hoping we get 12 out of this, and we only got six, but it wasn't from a lack of trying, or a lack of like putting your best foot forward, but, like collaborating and working with my creative teams is like something I put a lot of focus on, a lot of like, effort into. And not to comment on other editors or historical editors, but or how editorials deal with talent, but that comics will break your heart stuff comes from typically high level publishers, and this sort of monthly weekly grind that that I did aforementioned, and it takes a lot. One of the things that I always look at, I work 7 days a week, and partly it's I hate asking my talent to work weekends or holidays or anything along those lines. And they know that I'm there working with them. If they're asking me questions or looking for reference on Christmas Day, like, what am I going to do? Take like a week off and not, like they're dependent on me as much as I'm dependent on them. And it's an ecosystem that we have to maintain. And so, it takes I have to be like, whatever I'm asking them, I'm willing to do myself. And so this is not a 9 to 5 job for me. This is more like 6 to 7 job, whatever it was. Like DC, it was like 1 point like 5 to probably 7. You know what I mean? So it's a lot of
Yeah.
hours. Um, this isn't the country club lifestyle where it's just like Batman writes all the checks sort of stuff. At the DC, it was just like, man, the grind's real. And in the trenches, we're all in the trenches together. So
Yeah.
we make
It
great
says a
comics.
lot about you as a editor and as a person, and I think that's what I recognize in our short time together, and I'm sure that's what Skybound recognized, if I can segue,
Yeah.
when they hired you on as executive editor. But I want to know from your end, like what went into that calculus in terms of making the jump there from DC to Skybound.
Yeah, I was pretty burned out at DC. A big part of it, honestly, was so during the pandemic, under AT&T ownership, DC employees were approved to work remotely. Then when Discovery took over, they basically phased out remote workers as new workers. And so I was grandfathered in as a remote employee. So I live in Portland, Oregon. The DC offices are in Burbank, California. And so I was always a part of me was always paranoid that they were going to ring the bell. I know that the upper management of Discovery really likes, I think, hybrid, if not full, in office work. And so I was constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for that sort of shoe to drop. A lot of added stress when you're editing 12 books a month or whatever it was that I was doing. And and my work-life balance was sort of adversely affected in a lot of ways. Coming out of the pandemic, you have young children, getting them back to school. Like, there's demands that working grueling hours was hard to do. And so when the Skybound opportunity came about, in talking to I initially talked to like Robert Kirkman, and then talked, with Sean Mackwitz, and sort of, the MVP behind this like lines was a guy named Alex Antoon, who's the editorial director here at Skybound. So he was an intern for me at Wildstorm at one point, and then I hired him into DC back in 2011, 2012, and so then he had left for Skybound, like 5 years ago. So he put the bug in my ear and asked me, it was like, would you be interested in this stuff? Because we're looking to, bring someone on, probably take on the Energon universe and stuff. And so I clicked with them. They were full remote, so no stress there. Definitely, obviously, a company on the rise because at this point, Transformers with Daniel Warren Johnson and Mike Spicer and Russ Wooten was like crushing the sales charts, and like Cobra Commander was just debuting, and Duke was coming. So like Energon Universe was starting to heat up. They clearly had plans, and I'm like, oh, this, I feel like I could connect with this. This is my childhood. Transformers is, and G.I. Joe. It like helped form my identity, I guess, as like a young fan. And so this felt like a natural fit. And there was also the opportunity because as like I got props, I like wearing different hats. I like working on different content. Again, all the way back to being an assistant editor at Dark Horse, working on all this stuff and what appealed to Wildstorm. So here it's like come in the door. I'm working on the Energon universe. So I'm, Transformers 6 or Transformers 7, Void Rival 7, And then the Scarlet and Destro series last year, I took over those all immediately. But then I started working on Creep Show, which is like, this legacy horror anthology where it's like, oh, this is fun. I can do 10 pages of like, gruesome horror. And then, the door was open to do original series. Like, Ben, we want you to go find original stuff too. So there's a series right now called Ghost Pepper that we just sent the fourth issue to the printer like last week, I think. It's doing well received. It's my first original at Skybound. And so, I'm kind of living the dream in that sense, back to where that sort of space I like to be in, where it's like, you know, kind of the different silos of content, all like exciting and fun. And, it's great working with like Robert and Sean, and Skybound's just got a great staff. Everyone's sort of like, it kind of has that Wildstorm vibe again, where, we're all sort of rowing in the same direction, and it's like a focus and like an excitement for what we're doing. Like kind of end to end. It's like an impressive company. And there's also like, we'll have these all hands. And Skybound's a far bigger company than I even realized. Our publishing group, does this, but then we have all these other divisions. And, one of that was an appeal, honestly, too. The sort of mercenary side of Ben Abernathy, where I'm like, this is a company that's definitely on the rise and doing some great stuff. The Amazon series for Invincible obviously was like crushing in on The Walking Dead over the years and things along those lines. So I was like, this seems like a perfect fit for me. And the larger parent company, Image. So Skybound is an imprint of Image. Image's offices are here in Portland. So it was like, hey, look at that. If I guess I wanted to go work in an office, maybe I'd go down there and be like, hey, guys, what's up? I've never done that. And I don't really want to go back to an office, but I guess I could. So it just like kind of, it all sort of like, I thought, tracked, and just felt like the right opportunity. And so in January of last year, shifted over. January 2nd, back in the office. I quit. I was like, hey, Marie Javens, I got another job. Yeah. And so now, of course, I had to go out and buy all this sort of paraphernalia and all this kind of stuff. I got Transformers shirts and all that kind of jazz. But, and it's a great situation, too, with the Energon universe. Robert Kirkman is the showrunner and the sort of architect and the vision. And so working with, someone of his level and his experience, and he is such a hardcore fan of this material. It's just like it's inspiring and energizing in that sense. Energizing the Energon universe, sorry. But it's its own sort of like, it's just fun to come to work and like work on this content. And again, you put the hours in, right? I start working at 6 a.m. every day, you know what I mean? And like, and I don't say that as like, woe is me. I'm like, let's go. Like, this is like, get that going. And it's also the work-life balance, which I had mentioned, feels much more supported here. Everyone's got kids roughly my kids' age and stuff. And, I walk my kids to school and pick them up and stuff. And it works out great.
It feels like a kind of first full circle moment, right? Like back in Oregon, working on comics for not one of the big two necessarily, but sort of like the more loose but energizing kind of place, doing a diversity of different titles and formats. So it just seems like a great fit for you, and I'm excited for you. What did you have to, considering you were taking on the Energon universe? I know I have the cat behind me, but
that's very
a little
interesting.
Distracting for you
that's
YouTube
like,
viewers.
Tell me more.
But yeah, exactly. It's like I'm part of the Energon universe. But did you have to jump in and like go back and like read every Transformers and G.I. Joe like comic ever made to figure out what's going on?
Thank God, no, because that would have been a lot of work. No, this was, the Energon universe is our start of an entire, canon, an entire universe. So, I went back and read, starting with Transformers 1, our Transformers 1, and, the Cobra Commander and Duke series, reading all that content. And they're larger, like, documents and plans for the future. But no, anything that came before for us, whether it's IDW, Marvel, Dreamwave, Devil's Due, whomever, none of that impacts the Energon universe. The vision, the Energon universe in a lot of ways, and this is what appeals to me. And I got all my kids to it. Mike, this is crazy. Like, this is the first time in comics I've ever got my kids to read anything. They didn't care about Batman or Harley Quinn, but they were like, Transformers were in, because it's, the inspiration is Generation 1, which is like, again, this is a huge appeal to me, the Generation 1, toy line, cartoons, like for both, G.I. Joe and Transformers. is this sort of, inspiration, somewhat the blueprint. So, um, I went back and watched a lot of the cartoons. I'll tell you that, and that was informative. We watched the movie and the kids were like, "Oh, Optimus Prime dies." I'm like, "I told you this. You knew this was good."
Spoilers, Ben. Come
Yeah,
on.
sorry,
It's
sorry,
only 30
everybody.
years old.
It's only 30 years. Yeah, no,
40,
it'll be
40 years old, probably.
40 years
Yeah.
next year, 40th anniversary,
Yeah.
86. But so yeah, it was, just kind of absorbing everything that we were doing, and and like Void Rivals, which is the third monthly, or the launch of the Energon universe, but it's the third title along G.I. Joe and Transformers, all brand new. It takes a lot of inspiration from Transformers season 3 and the movie and stuff. So you'll see characters that were introduced in that, those different the movie and the series that pop up in there, but having an original piece to, like, these legacy titles is awesome. Like, what a great plan. Really. I mean, it's like, I can't say enough, like, what Robert and Sean, how, and Hasbro, how they framed all this stuff, because it's just like, it's amazing. And I'm very fortunate to be a part of this. So I was like, you guys want me? You
Yeah.
sure? Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Like, let's go. So
That's awesome.
been fun. Yeah.
So let's talk about, I mean, you already, I think, hinted at a lot of it, but what's coming up? You have Ghost Pepper, right?
Yep. Ghost Pepper.
The first creator owned that you're working on. You have the Energon universe. What else can we tell folks about? What's Skybound? Where
Well,
are you going with Skybound?
we got some cool stuff. So we'll kind of give the quick rundown here. On sale in October. Unfortunately, I don't have the dates right on hand. I'm terrible.
That's
No,
perfect because we don't know when it's coming out.
right. So in October, Transformers 25 drops. It's, a milestone issue, but it's also the debut of our, sort of our new core creative team, which is Robert Kirkman and Dan Mora.
Heard of those guys?
Yeah, they're up and comers.
Up and comers, yeah.
Jorge Corona draws, like a nice piece of that issue too, is sort of like a nice baton pass from the previous, the Daniel Warren Johnson run. So Daniel Warren Johnson wrote 24, the first 24 issues, drew the first 6, and Jorge was the artist, did a lot of that run. So Jorge is on 25 too, and then that starts a new direction. On Transformers, and with G.I. Joe, we're double shipping an event called Dreadnought War, which begins in November. So that sees Joshua Williamson, who's our sort of like G.I. Joe architect, and the return of Tom Riley, who drew our first 6 issues, as well as the Duke series. So very excited for that one. And with Void Rivals, issue 24, which is the end of Arc 4, is going to the printer next week. So, coming in December, we have the 25th issue of Void Rivals, and it's starting something that we're calling the Quintesson War. So big stuff coming on that front. The Creepshow Volume 4, the first issue just dropped last week. So still working on that Creepshow angle. I have a special coming out in October that I'm really excited for. I hope people like. It's called Super Creep Show, because again, I'm like, I always got to come up with these ideas. So we're doing like super powers with horror, which I thought could be a fun, fun thing to explore for a special, especially since, like, when we launched Creep Show a couple years ago, before I started, there were no horror anthologies on the market. It got, it was Eisner nominated. Alex Antone did an amazing job with that, first season, or like first volume. And now, like, last year when I took over Creepshow, I'm like, let's do this. And then, like, every publisher started doing horror anthologies. Like,
I was gonna say they're having a moment.
Image, yeah. It was like, oh man, for real. Like, I think Boom has, or I think like Boom has one. I think Oni Press has 2. And I was like, man. But so, the Super Creep Show, I feel like, kind of turns the horror on its ear, sort of like, leaning into like certain superhero tropes or powers, or great powers and great responsibility, all that kind of stuff. And so that's a lot of fun. Ghost Pepper's great. Ludo Lullaby is a tremendous writer artist on that book. He drew Transformers 19 for me. He drew World of Warcraft for Wildstorm way back in the day. A guy that's done, worked on Battle Chasers with Joe Mad. So did a lot of video game work, and he, it's a book I'm very proud of. Ghost Pepper, check it out. And then I've got some other stuff cooking that I can't quite talk about yet. Some originals, some other cool stuff. there's no stone left unturned. Oh, geez, I'm gonna get fired for this. I forgot. I also edited Battle Beast. By God, how did I forget that one? So yeah, so I was the co-editor on the first couple issues of Battle Beast because that book had been in the works for a bit. But Battle Beast is an absolute blast working with Robert Kirkman and Ryan Otley and Alyssa Leone on colors and Russ Wooten on lettering. A great team. Like anyone that likes Invincible. I was texting with a friend last night who's like a teacher down in Orange County. He's like, look at this kid. This kid had this Invincible shirt on. I was like, tell that kid to go buy Battle Beast because it's just, just sort of a wild, end-to-end action. Like Battle Beast is like, oh God, he's the coolest character. He's like as cool as Wolverine was when Wolverine was cool. You know what I mean? Just like kicking ass and taking names. And it's a beautiful book and it's just an absolute blast. Issue 6 just went to the printer. And so, yeah, we're kind of humming right along on that one as well. And then, gosh, let me see. Is there anything else I can mention? Probably not. Oh, no, I'm opening some folders here. You guys can't see it. So then you're like, what's Ben doing? Yeah, I think those are the main things that I can mention right now.
I mean,
but it's
sounds like quite a few, irons in the fire. So
always a lot, always a lot.
Yeah, and it's all great quality stuff. I mean, Skybound has been, knocking it out of the park for a while now, and so very excited to see more.
Yeah, we're very fortunate, We have a good relationship or a great relationship with retailers. Fans really respond to what we're doing. Mike, one of the weird things that, it's not weird, but there's like old school things, and Robert's passionate for this. We have like letter columns and on all the books, right? I was like, I hadn't done a letter column since 1999, I think, when I came on board here. Because I don't, DC and Wildstorm, I don't think we did letter columns. I don't remember. But working on letter columns every month and seeing the fan reaction, that sort of direct engagement, it's not like stuff on social media, where it's just people are mean, typically. But like very thoughtful sort of responses and like very articulate in their fandom and stuff. And it's fun.
Very cool.
Yeah. So anyway, write in letters. We'll publish them.
And we're back. It was awesome catching up with Ben. I didn't quite really understand the scope of his career. As I said, he's just been everywhere. Love him to death. I think if you talk to anybody who's worked with him, he's been mentioned on the show before, and always in a positive way, and just does a phenomenal job wherever he goes, and is doing a phenomenal job at Skybound. So we wish him all the best. We wish Skybound the best in continuing to kill it in the comic book market. But that'll do it for this week of shows in the Dollar Bin Bandits podcast. Thank you for listening. Thank you for viewing. Thank you for rating, reviewing, subscribing, supporting the show, doing everything to get this show into more and more and more people's ear holes. We have to end it on that. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next issue.